My husband didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult me outright. He just smiled, glanced at his phone, and said the sentence that quietly changed everything. "Your yoga instructor is so alluring," he said. "You should learn from her." For a second, I thought he was joking. Then I saw his eyes measuring, comparing, already somewhere else. Not with another woman exactly, but with the idea of one. A version of me he preferred. A version I was apparently failing to be. I felt something inside me go cold. Not angry, not hurt, clear. "You're right," I said. He blinked, surprised. He'd expected tears, defensiveness, maybe a fight he could later blame on my insecurity. Instead, I smiled. 2 days later, I sent my yoga instructor a thank you gift. Elegant, polite, perfectly reasonable. The kind of gesture no one could openly object to. Her husband opened it. And that's when my husband learned the difference between control and consequences. My name is Camila, and for a long time I believed my marriage was solid simply because it was quiet. My husband, Ethan, and I had been together for 11 years, married for 8. We lived in a restored craftsman house on a calm street in Austin, Texas, the kind with wide porches and neighbors who waved but never asked questions. From the outside, we looked like a couple who had figured things out. No public fights, no dramatic breakups, just routines. That was the problem. Everything had become a routine, including me. Ethan worked in sales. He liked to say he was good with people, which really meant he knew how to sound charming while steering conversations exactly where he wanted them to go. When we first met, that confidence felt exciting. He made decisions easily. He spoke with certainty. I mistook that for strength. Over time, his certainty turned into commentary. He commented on my clothes, not cruelly, never in a way that would sound bad if repeated, but constantly. "You know, that color doesn't really do much for you. You'd look amazing if you just put in a little more effort. Don't take this the wrong way, but confidence is everything." If I reacted, he'd sigh and tell me I was being sensitive. If I stayed quiet, he'd smile, satisfied, like the conversation had gone exactly where he wanted. Yoga wasn't supposed to mean anything. I signed up because my shoulders were always tense and my sleep had turned restless. The studio was small, warm, and calm in a way my house no longer felt. For 1 hour a few evenings a week, no one evaluated me. No one corrected my posture unless I asked. I could breathe without explaining myself. That's where Lena taught. She wasn't dramatic or overly friendly. She was composed, focused, and respectful. She didn't demand attention, she commanded it simply by being fully present. I admired her, not because she was beautiful, but because she seemed comfortable in her own skin. Ethan noticed her immediately. At first it was harmless, a comment here, a joke there, but soon her name started slipping into conversations that had nothing to do with yoga, comparisons disguised as observations, suggestions framed as advice. By the time he made that comment on the couch, the one about how alluring she was, I realized something uncomfortable. This wasn't about Lena. It was about how small he wanted me to feel standing next to her. After that night, Lena's name didn't disappear. It multiplied. It slipped into our conversations the way dust settles on furniture slowly, silently, until one day you realize everything is covered. Ethan didn't bring her up in obvious ways. He was smarter than that. He learned early on that people resist direct criticism, but they absorb comparison without even realizing it. So he wrapped every comment in something that sounded reasonable, supportive even. "Lena's discipline is impressive," he said one morning while I poured coffee. "You can tell she really commits to herself." I waited for him to say good for her. Instead, he looked at me. Another time, I came home from class tired but relaxed. That loose, calm yoga gives you when your body finally exhales. He glanced up from the couch and smiled. "You seem lighter," he said. "She really brings something out in people." In people. Not in me. At first I brushed it off. I told myself I was reading too much into it. Ethan had always admired confident women. That didn't mean anything. That shouldn't mean anything. But then the comments started stacking up. When I got dressed for class, he'd pause in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes scanning me in a way that made my skin prickle. "Are you wearing that?" he asked once. Not harshly, almost curious. Lena always looks so intentional, like she respects the space she's in. I stared at him, waiting for the joke. There wasn't one. I'm going to stretch and breathe, Ethan, I said. Not audition. He laughed, soft and dismissive. Relax. I'm just saying presentation matters. Presentation. That word echoed in my head during class, during Savasana, during the drive home. I tried to push it away, but it stuck. Soon, he started asking questions. Too many questions. How long is the class again? Does she ever do private sessions? Are you sure you don't want to take it more seriously? When I said no, that I liked it as it was, he raised an eyebrow. With access like that, he said, seems like a missed opportunity. Something shifted in my chest. Access. Like Lena was a resource. Like my body was a project. Like improvement was mandatory. I told him his comments made me uncomfortable. I chose my words carefully, the way women learn to do when they want to be heard without being labeled dramatic. He sighed. The long one. The one that says, here we go. You're twisting this, Camila, he said. I'm encouraging you. Isn't that what partners do? Push each other to be better? Better. I noticed how that word always came with a comparison, never with appreciation. He never said, I love how you are. He said, you could be more. I started noticing other things too. How he'd glance at my phone when it buzzed after class. How he'd casually ask, that Lena texting you? When it was clearly a group notification. How he'd joke about competition when I mentioned another instructor, then wave it off like I was imagining things. One night, we were sitting at the table, barely touching our food. He looked up and said, almost thoughtfully, you know what's attractive? I waited. People who invest in themselves. People who don't settle. The word settle landed between us like something fragile and sharp. I realized then that this wasn't about admiration. It was about power. Ethan wasn't trying to be with Lena, not directly. He was doing something quieter, something more calculated. He was holding her up like a mirror and asking me without ever asking why I didn't reflect back the same image. And beneath every comment, every comparison, every so-called piece of encouragement, was a message he never had to say out loud. If I wanted someone like her, I could. That's when I stopped explaining myself. I stopped defending my choices. I stopped asking him to understand. Instead, I watched. I watched how comfortable he was making me doubt myself. How confident he felt, assuming I'd swallow it. How certain he was that I wouldn't do anything about it. Once respect starts leaving a marriage, it doesn't storm out. It tests boundaries. It waits. It observes how much you're willing to tolerate. And I realized something important. He thought this was the beginning of me shrinking. He had no idea it was the moment I started planning. The strangest part wasn't what Ethan said after that. It was what he stopped saying. He no longer argued with me, no debates, no long explanations about how I was misunderstanding him. Instead, he switched tactics, one I hadn't noticed before because it was so quiet. He observed. If I mentioned yoga, he nodded thoughtfully. If I talked about work, he half listened. If I laughed at something on my phone, he'd glance over, curious but detached. Like he was waiting for something to confirm a theory he'd already decided on. One evening, as I folded laundry on the couch, he said casually, you know, Lena probably gets a lot of attention. I didn't look up. She's good at her job. That's not what I meant. He smiled. Men notice women like that. I folded a towel slowly, carefully aligning the edges. Men notice all kinds of women, I said. He shrugged. True, but not all women inspire. Imagination. That word again. Carefully chosen. Impossible to argue without sounding insecure. I felt the familiar urge rise up, the instinct to explain myself, to defend the fact that I was still me, that I was worthy without comparison. But for the first time, I didn't follow it. I let the silence stretch. Ethan glanced at me, waiting. When I didn't react, he frowned slightly, like a performer missing his cue. A few days later, he tried something different. He came home unusually cheerful, carrying takeout from my favorite place. Set it on the table, kissed my cheek, sat close enough that his knee brushed mine. You've seemed different lately, he said. How so? Quieter. He smiled. More thoughtful. I almost laughed. I've just been listening more, I said. That's good, he replied quickly. Listening is important. To him. That night, as we lay in bed, he turned toward me in the dark. You know, he said, voice low and conversational. Some couples grow because they challenge each other. I waited. They don't get defensive. They don't take everything personally. There it was. I turned my head and looked at him. His face was calm, confident, completely convinced he was being reasonable. I agree, I said. He stiffened slightly. You do? Yes, I smiled into the darkness. Growth matters. He relaxed, satisfied. I could almost feel it, the certainty settling back into him, the belief that this conversation had gone his way. But something else was happening too. I started noticing patterns. How often Lena's name appeared right after moments when Ethan felt ignored. How he brought her up when I seemed confident or content. How his comments always followed praise with a quiet reminder that I could be more. It wasn't random. It was strategic. One afternoon, while we sat on opposite ends of the couch, he asked, "Have you ever thought about doing private sessions?" I kept my voice neutral. No, really, he tilted his head. That surprises me. Why? He hesitated just long enough to make it feel intentional. Because if I had access to someone like her, I'd want to make the most of it. Access. That word again. I looked at him then, really looked at him. At how comfortable he was saying that. At how confident he felt implying ownership over a space that wasn't his. You think I have private sessions? I asked. He smiled, slow and knowing. I just assume. Assume what? That she gives you extra attention. I felt something settle into place. Not anger, not pain. Understanding. He wasn't accusing me, he was projecting. He wanted me to feel watched, measured, slightly guilty without knowing why. That way, I'd always be on the defensive, always explaining, always trying to prove something he never intended to grant. That night, after he fell asleep, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I replayed his words, his tone, the timing, and I realized something that changed everything. Ethan didn't believe I would leave. He didn't believe I would confront him. He didn't even believe I would push back. He believed deep down that I would adapt, that I would try harder. Dress differently. Become quieter. Smaller. More grateful for his guidance. He believed he had time. That was when I decided not to confront him. Because confrontation would give him a chance to deny, to reframe, to tell me I was imagining things. Instead, I decided to do something far more dangerous to a man like Ethan. I decided to take him at his word. If Lena was such an inspiration, if her presence was so powerful, if access was such a gift, then I would treat it exactly that way. And I would do it politely, calmly, publicly. I rolled onto my side, closed my eyes, and felt my heartbeat slow. By the time Ethan woke up the next morning, smiling and confident and completely unaware, I already knew what my next move would be. And he had no idea that the moment he thought he had won was the moment he lost control entirely. I didn't act right away. That was the hardest part. When you finally see a pattern clearly, every instinct tells you to expose it, to point at it and say, "There, look at what you're doing to me." But I knew Ethan too well. If I confronted him directly, he would deny it, minimize it, twist it until I was the one apologizing for reading into things. So I waited. I let him believe his strategy was working. I laughed a little more at his jokes. I stopped pushing back when he compared me to Lena. I even nodded once when he said, "You're starting to get it." That sentence almost broke me, but it also confirmed everything, because once he felt secure again, he became careless. That's when I heard him on the phone one evening, pacing in the kitchen while I pretended to scroll on my tablet. "She's really impressive," he said, voice low. "Yeah, the yoga instructor. Total presence. You'd get it if you saw her." He laughed softly, then added, "Some women just have it." He didn't notice me watching him. Didn't notice the way my hands had gone still. That night, after he went to bed, I sat at the dining table with my laptop open and my heart pounding not from fear, but from resolve. I searched Lena's studio website again. Her bio was exactly the same as before. Calm. Professional. No suggestion of anything inappropriate. Then I found her social media page. Mostly class schedules, inspirational quotes, the occasional photo of her hiking with her husband, Marcus. She had mentioned him once in class, casually. "My husband handles our finances. I'd be lost without him." I remembered the way she'd said it, matter of fact, affectionate, secure. That mattered to me. I wasn't trying to punish Lena. I wasn't trying to embarrass her. I was trying to introduce clarity. So I chose a gift that could not be mistaken for an attack. A wellness basket. Thoughtful, tasteful, expensive enough to feel intentional but not extravagant enough to look suspicious. Inside were herbal teas, a linen yoga towel, a handwritten card. I stared at the blank card for a long time. Every version I wrote at first was too angry, too obvious, too emotional, so I erased everything and started again. Thank you for all the inspiration and the private sessions. Your guidance has made a meaningful difference. No names. No accusations. No lies. Just ambiguity. I scheduled the delivery for late afternoon, right when the studio would be busiest, when people would be around, when it wouldn't disappear quietly into the back office. Then I closed my laptop and went to bed beside my husband. He slept peacefully, one arm thrown over my waist, breathing steady and unaware. The next morning, over breakfast, I told him what I'd done. I sent Lena a thank you gift, I said, stirring my coffee. He looked up too quickly. You did? Yes. I smiled. You were right. It felt appropriate. For what? He asked, though his tone had already changed. For all the private sessions, I said lightly. His fork froze halfway to his mouth. What private sessions? I tilted my head. Isn't that what you assumed? The color drained from his face, not all at once, but in stages. Confusion first. Then calculation. I never said you had private sessions, he replied carefully. You implied it, I said just as calmly. Repeatedly. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I could almost hear him rearranging his thoughts, searching for the version of this conversation where he stayed in control. That was a joke, he said finally. You know that? I nodded. Then there's nothing to worry about. He didn't answer. That night, he barely touched his dinner. He checked his phone constantly, went to bed early but didn't sleep. I slept better than I had in months. The call came the next afternoon. It was Lena. Camila, she said quietly. Did you send a gift to the studio? Yes, I replied. My voice was steady. I hope that was okay. There was a pause, long enough for me to hear her breathing. My husband opened it, she said. I closed my eyes. I see, I said. He was confused, she continued. So was I. I'm sorry if it caused discomfort, I said, and I meant it. That wasn't my intention. She was silent for a moment, then asked the question I knew was coming. Camila, she said carefully. What private sessions? And in that moment, everything shifted, because the gift had done exactly what it was supposed to do. It hadn't accused. It hadn't attacked. It had simply asked a question that could no longer be ignored. And once that question existed out in the open, between marriages, between truths, there was no way for Ethan to quietly reshape the narrative again. He came home that evening tense and defensive. Why would you do something like that? He snapped. Do you have any idea how that makes me look? I looked at him, really looked at him. That's interesting, I said. Because you never seemed concerned about how your comments made me feel. He clenched his jaw. You embarrassed me. I reflected you, I replied. He stared at me, shocked not by what I'd done, but by the fact that I wasn't apologizing. For the first time in years, I wasn't explaining myself. I wasn't softening my words. I wasn't trying to save his comfort. And that's when I knew the gift hadn't just reached Lena and Marcus. It had reached the part of Ethan that believed I would always stay quiet. That belief was gone now. And what followed next wouldn't be loud or violent, but it would be irreversible. I didn't hear from Lena again that night. But I felt the shift immediately. Ethan paced the house like someone waiting for bad news he couldn't stop. He checked his phone every few minutes, then tried to pretend he wasn't. When I asked if he wanted dinner, he said he wasn't hungry. When I asked if something was wrong, he snapped that I was hovering. Hovering. The irony almost made me smile. The next morning, he left early. Too early. He didn't kiss me goodbye. Didn't even look back when I said his name. The front door closed with a firmness that felt deliberate, like he needed something solid to push against. By noon, my phone rang. It was Lena again. Her voice sounded different this time, steadier, but edged with something sharper. Resolve, maybe. Or disappointment finally given a shape. My husband and I talked, she said. For a long time. I'm sorry, I replied. I never meant to put you in the middle of anything. I know, she said. And that's what makes this so unsettling. You weren't cruel, you weren't dramatic. You just held up a mirror. She paused. Camila, your husband has been messaging me. For months. I closed my eyes, my hand tightening around the phone. Not because I was shocked. Because I was relieved. Relieved that the truth no longer lived only inside my body. He never crossed a line that could be screenshotted and condemned, she continued. But it was suggestive. Persistent. Familiar in a way that made me uncomfortable, but not enough to call it out without proof. Marcus had seen the messages after the gift arrived. Not because Lena hid them, but because she hadn't thought she needed to. He asked me why your husband felt so comfortable speaking to me that way, she said quietly. And I didn't have a good answer. That afternoon, Ethan came home early. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He went straight to the kitchen, poured himself a drink, and sat down across from me like we were about to negotiate something. Lena's husband reached out, he said flatly. I assumed he would. I replied. She misunderstood everything, Ethan continued. She took things out of context. Did she? I asked. He frowned. Why are you doing this? I folded my hands on the table. I didn't start this, Ethan. Yes, you did, he snapped. You sent that gift. I responded to what you implied. That was nothing, he said. You're blowing it up. I leaned forward slightly. If it was nothing, why are you panicking? He stood up so suddenly his chair scraped the floor. You've made me look like a creep, he said. Like some kind of predator. I met his eyes. You made yourself look like that. He stared at me, breathing hard, then laughed short and bitter. So, this is what you're doing now? Playing innocent while you ruin my reputation? I didn't say a word about you, I replied. I didn't accuse you of anything. I sent a thank you note. You knew exactly what would happen, he said. Yes, I said calmly. I knew it would raise a question. He went quiet. That silence told me everything. Over the next few days, things began to unravel not explosively, but steadily, like a thread being pulled from a seam. Marcus asked for space. Lena took a leave from the studio to reset. Ethan started receiving fewer texts, fewer replies. Invitations he expected didn't come, and then came the call that changed the tone of everything. From my lawyer. Not because I had attacked Ethan, but because he had started telling people I was unstable, that I was jealous, that I was imagining things, that I was trying to sabotage his career. He hadn't learned anything, so I stopped waiting. I documented everything, comments, dates, patterns. I didn't dramatize. I didn't exaggerate. I simply recorded. When I told Ethan I'd spoken to an attorney, he laughed. You're overreacting, he said. This is just a rough patch. But his voice wasn't confident anymore. It was thin. Because for the first time, the story was no longer his to control. It was moving through conversations, through realizations, through questions he couldn't silence. And he knew what I knew too. Once a narrative leaves the private space where manipulation thrives, it doesn't come back the same. The gift had opened a door. The moment Ethan realized I had spoken to a lawyer, his tone changed. Not outwardly. Not at first. He became careful. Too careful. He stopped raising his voice, stopped pacing, stopped reacting the way he had when he thought this was still an emotional argument he could win. Instead, he adopted that measured, reasonable demeanor he used at work, the one that made people trust him. You don't really need an attorney, he said one evening, sitting across from me with his hands folded. This is a misunderstanding between spouses. Bringing outsiders into it just makes things messy. Messy. That was his new word. I looked at him and realized something unsettling. Ethan wasn't afraid of losing me. He was afraid of losing control of the narrative. I'm not bringing outsiders in, I replied. I'm protecting myself. He smiled tightly. From what? I didn't answer. Because if I had listed everything, the comparisons, the implications, the subtle pressure, the way he'd positioned me as inadequate while flirting with someone else, I knew exactly what he would say. You're interpreting it wrong. Instead, I let my attorney speak for me. Her name was Rachel Morgan, and during our first meeting, she didn't ask how I felt. She asked what I could prove. That question grounded me. I showed her messages Ethan had sent friends about Lena, nothing explicit, but dismissive enough. I showed her notes I'd kept over months, dates and phrases I'd written down because something about them felt off at the time. Rachel nodded slowly as she reviewed everything. This isn't about one comment, she said. It's about a pattern. That word again. Pattern. Under Texas law, Emotional coercion isn't always dramatic. It doesn't require shouting or threats. It shows up as erosion confidence worn down through comparison and implication until one person holds all the power. Rachel explained my options calmly. Separation, documentation, boundaries. No accusations unless necessary. Your strength here, she said, is restraint. When I told Ethan I wanted a trial separation, he laughed. Over a yoga instructor? He scoffed. You're proving my point. I didn't argue. I handed him a copy of the notice Rachel had prepared, formal, neutral, impossible to twist into hysteria. His smile disappeared. You're serious, he said. Yes. That night, he didn't sleep in our bed. He didn't leave either. He stayed on the couch, sending messages he didn't want me to see. The next day, Marcus contacted my lawyer. Not angrily, not threatening, carefully. He wanted everything documented. He wanted distance from Ethan. He wanted assurance that whatever had happened would not quietly resurface later under a different name. That was when Ethan finally understood what the gift had triggered. Not drama, process. He tried one last time to pull me back in emotionally. You know I never touched her, he said one night, voice low. You know I didn't cheat. I know, I replied. He frowned. Then why are you doing this? Because you didn't need to touch her to hurt me. That answer ended the conversation. From that point on, communication went through attorneys. Words became precise. Assumptions vanished. So did his confidence. For the first time in our marriage, I wasn't reacting to him. I was responding on record, with intention and with protection. And that was when Ethan realized something far more frightening than anger. I wasn't emotional anymore. I was prepared. And prepared women don't argue. They proceed. Ethan thought the worst of it was over. That was his final mistake. Once lawyers were involved and emotions were no longer feeding the fire, he assumed the story would cool down. Quiet separation, minimal damage. A controlled exit where he could still present himself as the reasonable one, the husband who had simply been misunderstood. What he didn't account for was momentum. Truth, once it starts moving, doesn't need help. It only needs space. Marcus didn't confront Ethan in person. He didn't shout or threaten. He did something far more destabilizing. He asked questions, in writing, and asked them to be answered clearly. Why had Ethan messaged Lena late at night? Why had the tone shifted from professional to personal? Why did he feel comfortable commenting on her body, her presence, her energy? Each question was polite, each one impossible to laugh off. Ethan tried to explain it away at first. Jokes, compliments taken the wrong way, harmless admiration. But when Marcus requested that all future communication go through attorneys, Ethan panicked. That was when his behavior changed. He started calling me again. Not angrily, urgently. This has gone too far, he said over voicemail. You need to fix this. Fix this. As if the truth were a spill I'd made and not a structure he'd built. I didn't respond. Then came the shift in tone. You're really going to destroy everything over nothing? I never meant to hurt you. You know I love you. Love. He hadn't used that word in months. The final attempt came 3 days later, when he showed up unannounced at my office. He stood in the lobby, hands in his pockets, looking smaller than I remembered. Less certain. We need to talk, he said. I stepped outside with him, not out of obligation but to keep the conversation public. You're making me look like a monster, he said quietly. People are asking questions. That happens when patterns become visible, I replied. I didn't cheat on you, he insisted. You know that. Yes, I said again. And that's not the point. His jaw tightened. Then what is? The point is that you treated my worth like something negotiable, like something I could earn by becoming someone else. He stared at me, searching for the version of me that would soften, that would reassure him, that would make this end neatly. It didn't exist anymore. You compared me until I doubted myself, I continued. You implied I was replaceable. You watched me shrink and called it growth. That's not fair, he said quickly. It's accurate, I replied. Something in his expression cracked then, not guilt, but fear. Because this wasn't a fight he could win with charm or volume. This was an accounting. By the end of the week, the separation became formal. Not dramatic, not explosive, just final. Ethan told people his marriage had ended because I was too sensitive. I didn't correct him, because the people who mattered had already noticed something else. That he was always the common denominator in stories that ended quietly but badly. Marcus and Lena decided to take time apart as well, not because of an affair, but because trust doesn't reset just because boundaries were technically respected. Lena thanked me for the honesty I never forced on her, and I thanked her for believing me without needing proof of catastrophe. The irony wasn't lost on me. No one had been screamed at, no one had been publicly shamed, no one had raised a hand. And yet, everything Ethan relied on, his image, his certainty, his authority, was gone. That was the real collapse. Not loud, not violent, just undeniable. And standing in the quiet aftermath, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not triumph, relief. Because the hardest part wasn't exposing him. It was choosing myself loudly enough that he could no longer pretend I was invisible. The quiet after a collapse is strange. There's no applause, no dramatic final scene, just space wide, unfamiliar, and honest. For weeks after the separation became official, I kept expecting to feel something sharper. Anger, vindication, regret. But what settled in instead was calm. The kind that doesn't rush you, doesn't demand explanations, doesn't ask you to perform healing on anyone's timeline but your own. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of the city. Nothing fancy. Sunlight in the mornings. A balcony just big enough for a chair and a cup of coffee. The first night there, I slept with the windows open and realized I hadn't done that in years. Somewhere along the way, I'd learned to keep things sealed. Yoga felt different now. Lena returned to teaching after a short break, and when I walked into her class for the first time again, she met my eyes and nodded. No awkwardness, no pity, just respect. That mattered more than any apology could have. After class, we talked. Not about Ethan, not about the gift, about boundaries. About how easily admiration can be weaponized when power is uneven. About how women are often taught to doubt themselves before they're taught to trust their instincts. Marcus had chosen to step back from the marriage not out of rage but clarity. He told Lena he needed time to process what almost happened, not what technically didn't. I admired that honesty. It felt rare, adult. As for Ethan, he tried to reach out one last time. A message, carefully worded, nostalgic, full of what if we'd communicated better. I read it once. Then I deleted it, not out of cruelty but because I finally understood something essential. Closure doesn't come from the person who caused the harm. It comes from the moment you stop waiting for them to validate your experience. Work stabilized. My focus sharpened. Without the constant background noise of being evaluated at home, my confidence returned in ways I hadn't expected. I spoke more clearly in meetings. I stopped apologizing before stating opinions. My manager noticed. So did I. Friends I'd grown distant from started reappearing, gently at first. Dinners, long walks, conversations that didn't revolve around fixing or explaining. They never said we told you so. They didn't have to. They just made space for the version of me that was no longer trying to earn her place. One evening, months later, I sat on my balcony watching the city lights flicker on. I thought about the gift, the one moment people might reduce this entire story to. But it was never about the basket. It was about refusing to absorb disrespect quietly. It was about responding without becoming someone I didn't recognize. I didn't yell. I didn't expose. I didn't retaliate. I clarified. And clarity has consequences. Here's what I learned, what I wish someone had told me sooner. If someone keeps comparing you to others, it's not because you're lacking. It's because comparison gives them leverage. If someone tells you they're just trying to help, but you feel smaller afterward, that's information, not insecurity. And if you ever feel the urge to shrink to save a relationship, pause. Ask yourself who benefits from that version of you. The truth is, respect doesn't need volume. Boundaries don't need anger. And walking away doesn't mean you lost. Sometimes, the most powerful reply isn't confrontation. It's choosing yourself so clearly that no one can pretend you didn't. That was my reply. And it was the first one that finally felt like mine.